Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's HDI webinar, Good Communication Practices Aren't Just for Major Outages. Today's webinar is brought to you by Everbridge. And we're always happy to have a sponsorship that allows these webinars to go on and remain free. If you experience any difficulty with the webinar itself, you can get help by clicking on the yellow question mark icon at the bottom of your screen. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the webcast. Click on the red QA button and just type your question into the Ask a Question text area to the right of the presentation window, and then click the Submit button. Simple enough. At this time, we would recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers because there will be a pop-up window later in the webcast. To chat with others who are attending today, click on the group chat icon at the bottom right of your screen. We love having you exchange ideas during the webinar. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you can download a copy of the slides. This is a frequently asked question here, so you can download a copy of the slides by clicking on the green folder icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you're experiencing any technical problems, please type your issue into the QA text area, and we'll be sure to offer one-on-one assistance. Remember that today's webinar will be available on demand starting at this time tomorrow, so after 24 hours, and you will receive an email reminder to let you know it's available. So if you wanted to watch again, listen to some of the things that were said, or review with your teammates, you'll be able to do that on demand. You can connect with HDI on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and on hdiconnect.com, where you can read a blog, ask a question, or find a solution. So joining us to be the featured speaker today is Mike Hansen. Mike has been involved in many aspects of IT over the past 30 years, from application development to the service desk to desktop support. Today is the Director of Technology for Optum Inc., a part of United Health Group. He proactively seeks ways to improve global service delivery to more than 150,000 clients through lean process improvement, knowledge management, demand management, and training. He also oversees asset management functions such as forecasting, procurement, fulfillment, and recovery at offices worldwide. Mike is a certified HDI Support Center Manager, a Six Sigma Green Belt, and holds ITIL Foundation and Practitioner certificates. He's a current member and past chair of the HDI Desktop Support Advisory Board, where he is a wonderfully participative member, I might add, and is currently the VP of Content for the HDI Skyway local chapter. So we're very pleased to have Mike with us today. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Roy. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great day. Today we're going to be talking about communication, specifically business communication. We're going to start kind of by examining how business communication has changed over the years, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of fun looking at this, reminiscing about how things have changed, especially for those of us that are kind of old enough to remember some of these changes. Really, of all the processes that are available to business, technology has probably had the biggest impact in changing how information moves, which is really what communication is all about. There are some challenges that we face across all of business, but there are others that are really more specific to IT and IT support teams. We'll really talk about some of those challenges, and then we're going to talk about how we can leverage technology. I mean, we are IT, right? We're going to leverage technology to become a little bit more effective in how we communicate. So let's kick this off by taking a look back. Maybe ancient history, like when I was going to school. I could have went back further to when everything was, like written in actual pen or pencil, longhand on paper, but I figured that actually was ancient history, and we should probably stay in the 20th century. The only place you'll really find a typewriter nowadays is at a flea market or a garage sale or maybe eBay. There might be a few folks that still use them, but probably few and far between. Where I see typewriters most often today is, people making jewelry from the keys or the parts, the steampunk type stuff. But think about what typewriters meant for a moment. I mean, we talk about cutting and pasting today, back then, cutting and pasting was literally cutting and pasting, cutting stuff out of a document and pasting it into another document. You didn't have spell check, except you had a dictionary, and you want to do your spell checking actually before you wrote your document. If you needed more than one copy, you had to use carbon paper, which, for those who've never heard of carbon paper or seen it, was actually a film of carbon that you'd put between 2 or 3 sheets of paper. It was messy, and you better hope you didn't make any mistakes, because there wasn't really deleting except by you using an actual eraser or a little bottle of white paint to white out the mistake. Saving would have been a hard copy only, so archiving would be putting that hard copy in a file folder on your desk. And if you actually need to make any changes, the slightest change, it meant you had to rewrite the whole document. There were books and style guides galore out there that would teach you how to format and write memos on a typewriter, essentially the templates that you would use in those days. And every time you would use one, you'd have to manually retype it. So when you consider the difficulty of using a typewriter, it's not surprising that a word processor was one of the first common business machines. They really were dedicated systems that offered this amazing ability to save documents in an electronic format and reprint them later, mail merge them, maybe even have basic spell check. The problem with them was they were big, they were expensive, they were proprietary. And if you learned how to do word processing, for example, on a Xerox system, that really didn't prepare you for using, say, a system from Wang Laboratories. And what's really fascinating is when you think about it, this was common practice only about 20 years ago. So it's been within most of our generations that these things have changed. So you've used your typewriter, right, and you've typed out a nice document. Now you have to distribute it. Unfortunately, your methods for distributing that document are somewhat limited. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this little evil yellow envelope. When I was younger, in an office, we would ship crates of these things from office to office, and then our mail rooms would put them on carts and, actually manually walk through the office and distribute them out to everyone's inboxes. They were reusable. So once you got your mail out, you'd scratch out your name and you'd readdress it and send it along. And after a while, they started looking kind of like that. You'd start being afraid to touch them after a bit. You couldn't send all, you couldn't reply all. If you wanted to involve more than one person, you either relied on the person you were sending it to send it along, or you sent out a whole bunch of these things to everybody that you wanted to see the document. So as you can imagine, we literally shuffled a lot of paper. Still see these things occasionally, but they've kind of really went the way of the buggy whip. You don't see them very often. If you had a business at the time, if you had a business that was national or international, you might have access to what they call a telex machine. It was kind of like a typewriter that was attached to a phone line, and it would enable you to send text messages across the country or across the world, but at a pretty high cost, usually like a per word charge. Obviously, not all communication was written. We're not so far back into ancient history that the phone didn't exist. But it was really different than what we have today. If you only go back 50 years, mechanical switching was very common. It was still in use as recently as the 80s. What that meant is if you were an individual or you were a small business, you had to rely heavily upon the phone company to connect your phone to the rest of the world. There wasn't any such thing as free long distance. In fact, it was often ridiculously expensive, like 75 cents or $1 a minute for domestic calls. And if you wanted to make an international call, I could say they were a lot more expensive, and they were, but the fact was that the odds of actually connecting an international call reliably was hit or miss. If you were a really big company, you probably had a whole bank of these things down in your basement. The devices would have looked something like what's in this picture. There would be a live person sitting at each of the switchboards, and their sole purpose was using these cords and plugs to connect people within and outside the building. Needless to say, there was no voicemail. If someone called for an executive in the building, and at the time the execs were probably the ones that rated having a telephone, instead of going to a voicemail, it would have went to their secretary, or as we would call them, an admin assistant today. They would answer the phone. let the caller know that the person wasn't available, and they'd take down a message on this little pink piece of paper. You'd come into the office, and you'd have stacks of these things everywhere. Unfortunately, people paid about as much attention to the little pink pads as they do to voicemail today. I actually had the pleasure of using a switch like this when I was younger. I worked at the Fountainhead Resort in Oklahoma, which was owned by the state. I'm not sure if it still exists or even if the state still owns it, but at the front desk was one of these things, and I would use it to connect people, incoming calls to the rooms or the business offices. It looks a lot more difficult than it is. It's really just completing connections, but I can't imagine what it would have been like to see, hundreds or tens or hundreds of these things in the basement of a building. In the 70s, though, there was an interesting change. Email came along. Early versions of email would only allow messages to be sent between people who were on the same system, usually a big mainframe system. This meant that the early users were the technical folks who were, working on that mainframe. Since the machines weren't networked, it was really limited. But once computers began to be networked, there needed to be some way to address messages to each other and send them across that network. The gentleman named Ray Tomlinson was an ARPANET contractor, and he's the guy that's credited most often with coming up with a way to do that. He did that by inventing a symbol, or at least utilizing a symbol, this @ sign that we're also familiar with in email addresses today. While it was valuable for universities and the military, there were some hobbyists that might be using it. It didn't really start to have true business applications until MCI Mail and CompuServe came along in the late 80s. These were still more or less focused on hobbyists. I remember my CompuServe email was a string of numbers, I think like 9 digits long, followed by @cis.com, so not very intuitive. But then in 1993, America Online came along, and along with other services like Prodigy, everybody started getting these discs in the mail, right? And everyone started getting online and using email. Between work and home, it seemed like I got at least one disc a day from one of these services, and there's so many, they were so prevalent that it's actually created a new hobby. If you go online, there are people who collect these discs and have tried to find all the different ones that AOL or other services used. As with most things that catch on within the consumer space, email was really catching on in the business. And today, we can really say that email is probably the most important business application that we support, because without it, we simply can't communicate. As written communication evolved into email, our verbal communications continue to evolve as well. You might remember phones like this from time to time. You might still see them from time to time. With these, you could put somebody on hold or do basic conferencing, depending on how many lines you had coming into the phone. You didn't have a switchboard anymore, but you may have had a receptionist that managed how calls were distributed. But one thing did happen during this period that was kind of a paradigm event, and that was the fax machine. New documents now didn't have to be sent over a telex or through regular mail. They could be actually sent through phone lines on a fax machine. The quality wasn't great, but it did eliminate the need for mail in situations where timing was critical. Some of you could probably remember the early machines that used that thermal-based paper that was really flimsy and difficult to read, or you remember the frustration of not being able to connect to someone's fax machine, or having someone think your personal phone was a fax machine and getting those tones in your ear, which still happens to me from time to time. Now we've reached one of the biggest events to hit business, and that's the digital age. The IBM released their first desktop PC in 1981. The machine was horribly expensive compared to what we have today, but now business is capable of having everyone that needs it have access to what we would consider power apps today, VisiCalc and WordStar. If you don't know what those are, they were the first spreadsheet and word processing platforms, and they literally transformed how we did business and how people work. In 84, IBM released the AT, and other companies like Compaq, HP, they started building IBM-compatible PCs, and the digital age was kind of off and running, especially once they became a consumer item, and more people began to have computers like this at home. These machines were put on a network generally, and so email started to make really serious progress as a business communication tool. From a phone perspective, now we have smaller, efficient phone switches that bypass the phone company and enable us to do all those things that we've been wanting to do. We can do conferencing. We can do voicemail. Might even have the beginnings of an IVR, which is that automated response system where you press 1 or press 2 or, to get where you need to go. I'm not sure whether that was a positive development from a communication perspective, but, at least it eliminated the need for a live receptionist to direct calls. This was the time that was also the dawn of technical support, where folks like you and I, who might have had the aptitude to help out people with their technical problems and start troubleshooting the problems that these devices had. I recall, again, in my younger days, I worked on an old phone switch, Northern Telecom PBX, and was Unix-based, and everything on it was done via the command line, and so you had to build a new phone. You'd have this long, hundreds of characters string of text to tell that switch what to do, and if you created a typo, you had to do the whole thing over again. I can't tell you how much of a joy it was when we got later AT&T switches that were menu-based, and even later than that when Sun Microsystems had graphical user interfaces. It was much easier to work with it. This was also the time when those online services that we talked about earlier, AOL and Prodigy and whatnot, are starting to really catch on and boom. There are advances in how fast you can connect. At the time, most folks are using modems. Slow modems from 1200 up to fast modems at 1400. You'd be shocked what I had to pay when I upgraded to my first 9600 modem. But that was how you linked to the outside world in the 80s. Eventually, in the early 90s, most of these services had actually started to link to the World Wide Web. So now things really start picking up and moving. Mosaic released the first web browser in 93. This became the basis for Netscape. In 1997, Microsoft came out with Hotmail, which opened email up to the masses. It also opened it up to a whole bunch of spammers. The first blogs started showing up. Instant messaging became mainstream when AOL released their instant messenger. And then in 1998, a small technical startup called Google came on the scene. Things have never been the same since. And peer-to-peer file sharing was in the news in 1999. There was a company called Napster that actually got into some trouble because of peer-to-peer sharing. The early 2000s also became a busy time for social media, and a lot of those initial or original social media sites like MySpace or Friendster became popular. By the middle of 2000s, all the ones that we're familiar with today, such as Facebook and Twitter and Flickr, they've all come along by the middle of the 2000s. Audio and video is part of this explosion. The Apple released the iPod in 2001. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but yes, it was in 2001. Podcasting came out in 2004, and how anyone could fail to recognize the huge impact to our culture from YouTube, which came on the scene in 2005. It was during this period that if you went to the mall and went to one of the computer stores, the shelves were full of these apps that you could use to edit video, rip CDs, create MP3 files. Pirating of audio files in particular was in the news, and Napster was the one that got in trouble because of how many of their members were sharing this copyrighted material. On the business side, technology is becoming mission critical, and IT support isn't just the folks that have an aptitude and get tapped on the shoulder now and then. It's now a dedicated function, and most of our time is now spent helping people get back to work. Really, when you think about it, our whole job is about giving the business the tools they need to communicate, whether that be email, productivity apps, file sharing. Early 2000s were actually really growth years for IT support because, these business tools were really, really important, but making them work and, all that background support stuff was still pretty complicated. Now we're ready for the next step. And Arthur C. Clarke, who was a very famous science fiction writer, he had an interesting quote. He said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." That kind of brings us to the next phase of things, which is mobility. When you read, science fiction from the early days, the 50s and the 60s or the 70s, a fairly common theme is, the handheld computer that has access to data at any time, anywhere. If you remember watching the original Star Trek from the early 60s, they had these pads, these electronic clipboards. Some pretty little ensign in a miniskirt would give Captain Kirk the pad, and he would sign it. Or something. Honestly, it kind of looks like a clunky Etch-a-Sketch when you look at it, but think about it, what it means. When you look at a modern tablet, an iPad, realize that the folks in the 60s, the early 60s, they couldn't even imagine what we were going to have today, or how small and how capable things were going to be, or how fast it would come. This is their idea of what the future looks like. The mobility revolution's had an enormous impact on how we communicate. This is a technology, but it's not driven by technologists. It's actually driven by the consumer. And the consumer tends to have a really strong desire to kind of keep up with what's the latest and the greatest and the most current thing, whether it be a smartphone or a tablet. You'll see them standing in line, weeks in advance for the newest iPhone release. The problem is that these things get released on a schedule that most IT teams, we just can't accommodate it. The consumer culture is driving the idea of mobility, and this is of a real concern to IT support, right? Because it's one of the most common questions that we hear when we go to our conferences is, what are we going to do about mobility? What are the challenges that we have? How are we going to deal with this stuff? It's like this huge, specter, Terminator that looms over us because, we're used to being able to control things, and the consumer really controls the idea of mobility. When I travel to Mexico or the Philippines, it's interesting because you'll see people who don't have any shoes. Their house may have a dirt floor, but the whole family will have some sort of smartphone. And it really does bring home just how important communication has become. How often have we went to a restaurant and you see whole families sitting around the table? They're not talking to each other. They're all on their phones texting or updating. It's a little disconcerting, and I'm not sure that it's a positive development, but it is showing how pervasive mobility is. A recent study asked people how often they checked email or social media, and over half said they do it in the middle of the night or first thing in the morning. And it's even spawned addiction studies because people actually go through withdrawal similar to drug addiction when they lose their connectivity. So it really gives you something to think about. Really think about how much our ability to communicate has evolved, which within really a single generation. We went from those things like typewriters and interoffice mail and simple telephones to a world where, we can send a text or audio or video around the world at our fingertips anytime from anywhere. We can influence the news. We can become a celebrity. We can state an opinion that's seen by millions of people just in an instant by typing something on our phone. So we really do live in an amazing time. So it raises the question, we have more ways to communicate than we ever have had before. But if we have more ways to communicate than ever before in history, why is it that so many IT teams or IT organizations do such a terrible job at communicating? Technology has been a huge help to the business. We support them in their communication, but let's face it, it hasn't always made things easier for us. So let's talk about some of the challenges that we face as an IT organization, not just in how we communicate with our peers and our technical partners, but and how we communicate with the non-technical folks on the business side, people or teams. First thing we want to talk about is our environment. While being in a single office or in one building might seem like it would provide an advantage for communications, that's not always the case. Because when we're close to folks, we tend to fall into the trap of maybe just talking to specific individuals. maybe neglecting communication to the whole office. Maybe you mention an upcoming deployment to a manager and next to you in the cubicle next to you, and then assume that they're going to pass it along, but that never happens. And remember, communication is a two-way street, so the same thing can happen in reverse, where maybe people in the business are coming to individuals on our team and pulling them into projects or issues, and we're not aware of what's happening. It's done without our knowledge. Distributed organizations have other problems. Not being physically with someone means you lose a lot of data when you're communicating. There are visual cues. There's body language that we pick up on subconsciously that we miss when we're on the phone. And we miss both that visual and the audio cues when we're using textual processes like email or instant messages. The tone of our voice, not being able to hear other people, trying to get a word in when someone just won't stop talking. All these things can impact it. I know I've been on calls where people just keep talking and talking and talking, and no one can get a word in edgewise to offer their comments. I've actually had employees where I've had to mentor, jumping out on IM and sending them a text message telling them that they need to stop talking so other people can contribute. Email can be even worse because people, feel safer saying things in email than they would ever say to someone's face. If you've ever gone out to the internet and looked in the comments section of an internet forum, you'll clearly see that there's a failure to communicate in action there. And then when we move into the international arena, things get even more challenging. There are cultural issues that we need to be aware of that impact how we communicate. In my company, we have a global reach. We have offices across the world. And when dealing with folks in countries like India, the Philippines, it's very different culturally than working with offices here in the U.S. or in Europe. For example, it took me months longer to build a new department in Manila than it would have locally. And it wasn't because of the distance, and it wasn't because of the time zones, although that did influence things. But rather it was because the culture in the Philippines is to avoid they avoid the kind of direct and in-your-face communication that we practice here in the United States. They avoid conflict, and to avoid conflict, they tell us, yeah, we understand, we're okay, and reality was they were just avoiding having to tell us they weren't clear on a process. In India, something similar. We'd work to build what we thought was a clear process. We would work with the teams there. We'd get their buy-in, and they would agree that they understood and that they would do that process from this point forward, and then we'd find out months later that they weren't following it because something along the way didn't work, wasn't clear, and rather than coming to us and telling us, they just create a workaround or even an entirely new process. Language, obviously, is another challenge when dealing with global business. Some countries like India and the Philippines have an advantage when working with the U.S. because they do tend to speak English, but many countries don't. And an example was we're expanding into Brazil, so we've started getting notes from our leadership asking us if anybody can speak Portuguese so that we can begin communicating with our teams there. One of the other things that I really noticed, though, is that even if someone speaks English, that doesn't necessarily mean that they understand English, and that leads to the concern of perception. Even when dealing with these offshore staff that spoke English, we found that there was a disconnect because English isn't their first language, and they didn't always understand what we were trying to tell them. And you combine that with the cultural reluctance to simply say, I don't know what you're talking about or I don't understand, it generates some real complications. This is especially true when you're trying to pass on complex concepts, like requirements for a new application, software development things. It's critical that they understand that the requirements are, and they have to be willing to speak up and tell you if they don't understand. So we found that there was, still a reluctance to do that, even after repeatedly telling them that nobody was going to be hurt or angry. So it took us quite a long time for them to get over their perception that they could speak up and not cause a problem. I could go on and on about these challenges, but let's go on. Let's move on from where folks are to who they are. We're going to be talking about the audience quite a bit for the rest of the presentation, because beyond the size or distribution of the organization, how we approach communication has a lot to do with who we're communicating with. If you're a leader within an IT, odds are you have two channels. You have an upstream channel and a downstream one. You have to communicate to staff. You have to communicate to your leadership. And then you have business communication, which may be the same. You may have to communicate to business leaders as well as business staff. Now, when we communicate to our staff, we usually know them, and we know that they'll probably understand a technical discussion. What they probably won't necessarily understand is, business issues. So as leaders, we have a responsibility as their manager to translate those business priorities to a language that they'll understand. Do we do a good job of that? Not always. I know in our company, when we have the annual survey, it's not uncommon to see us have lower marks from communication. Interestingly, it's either we don't communicate enough or we communicate too much, but there's always interesting marks around communication. Now, communication upstream to your leadership is different from how we communicate to staff, because leadership is generally interested in strategic vision. They want to know the goals rather than the tactical means that we're going to use to get there. And we really need to understand and know how those folks expect to be informed. Some leaders like to just get bullet points. Others like a lot more detail. I mean, I've had bosses that were pretty fast and loose and were good with a phone call now and then I had others that were just maddeningly pedantic about things. They wanted things organized just in a certain way. They monitored your grammar, or worse, they monitored how you did spreadsheets. And you better be able to explain every data point, every formula about how you arrived at a conclusion. When we look external, we have the opposite problem. We may be communicating with teams or individuals who have no technical background at all. They probably understand the business priorities really, really well. So now, as leaders, we have a responsibility of translating technical issues into a language that the business can understand. If we get too technical, or we start using a lot of acronyms, we can lose them. They'll either stop reading our communications or they'll stop listening to us. I'm not sure, what the experiences of the folks on the call might be, but in my experience as a whole, we're not very good at communicating with our business leadership. We don't know what they want to hear. It honestly doesn't come up very often. So, we tend to ignore it. But they do hear from us from time to time. When do they typically hear from IT? And specifically, when do they most often hear from technical support? They hear from us when something's broken. When systems go down, or there's network problems, or there's issues with telecom, or specific apps are experiencing problems, that's when the business hears from us. Or maybe something's not necessarily broken, but we have some sort of major deployment. Maybe a new operating system or a new office productivity suite, something that's big in the works that requires some sacrifice on their part and require them to take time away from their work to get training or what have you. In other words, we're letting them know something big is happening. We're going to need something from them. Now think about the precedent that this is setting. The only time they really hear from us is when something's broken or when we need something from them. So if you put yourself in their place, would you look forward to hearing from IT? How do your business partners react when they see an email from us? Do they expect bad news? Are they going to be afraid to open it? Or are they just going to ignore it, say, I never got it? Maybe if I ignore it, it'll just go away. So what should we communicate? Communicating about outages, and changes is an important part of what we do. But can we do a better job in how we communicate when these things happen? When a system or an application goes down, letting the customer know that the system or application is down is redundant. They probably already know that there's an outage there. Stating the obvious isn't going to win us any friends, and probably is just going to frustrate folks. What they really want to know is what happened, who's impacted, when it's going to be fixed. Those are the key things we have to communicate when stuff breaks. Communicate that we know what's happened, that we recognize the scope of the problem, and that we can explain. Again, we have to explain in layman's terms so that the business can understand what we're doing to fix it and when we're expecting the system to be back up. It's very important that we follow up regularly when these things happen so that we can give them updates on any changes. If you happen to have an IVR at your service desk, you can put a message out there in the greeting that tells folks that there's a problem and that we're working at it. That way you kind of nip the call in the bud so that it doesn't back up the service desk with unnecessary calls. And, once you fix the problem, don't go silent. Follow up with some communications that state that, at some point, send an after-action report that details what happened and what we did to fix it and what we're doing to prevent it from happening again. Same thing can be said about major changes to the technical environment. They should be handled in the same way. Clear communication that explains what's being done, and really, don't forget, you should explain why it's being done, and what we expect the impact to be, whether, it's going to be downtime, reduced functionality, are they going to need training? Let them know what the schedule is, remind them on a regular basis so that they're not surprised, and reassure them that, we're prepared if there's a failure and we need to roll back the problem, we know what to do there. Really, the overarching message to all of this communication should be that we care about their ability to do business, and we're being very careful to make sure there's as little impact to the business as possible. So those things address the big flashy stuff. And there's loads of other communicating that we can do outside of the big events. Sit down with your business leadership. Find out if there's anything specific that they'd like to see on a regular basis. Maybe our first call resolution for the help desk, or first contact resolution for second level support, or maybe they don't care about the first contact issues, but rather want to see how long it took us to resolve the issues, in its entirety, the mean time to resolve. There's lots and lots of potential metrics out there. You can actually go and look at the annual HDI Salary and Practices Guide and look at what other organizations are monitoring and doing for some suggestions there. And even if you meet with them and they tell you that there's nothing that they want to see on a regular basis, we should still occasionally send out some sort of communication, whether it's just a marketing communication that celebrates our successes, newsletters, what have you. Make the business aware that we're not just there to inconvenience them with outages and deployments, that we are actually working very hard in the background to respond to their issues, keep them working, and make them successful. Now let's look at some specific challenges. As I mentioned before, email is by far the biggest, highest utilization, most critical application that we use in the business environment. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things that can go wrong when we use this particular tool. First, I'm going to repeat it again. Consider who your audience is. Like any communication, we have to know that the audience is going to be able to comprehend what you're saying. And with email, that actually goes way beyond the initial person that you're sending the email to. We really need to consider who else might see it beyond that first recipient. We've all seen emails that just keep going and going and going. I was recently copied on a chain that was almost 20 pages long. That's moving from being a simple communication to being a short story or a novella. And as that long email chain moved through its whole life cycle, more and more people were looped into the distribution. Some folks were pulled in for a quick opinion or an approval, and they just ended up as a permanent part of the email chain. But that's really why it's important that we give consideration to not just the first person we're sending it to, but anybody that might ultimately be copied on it. You're never going to know for sure, and it can still get out of control. But when we think that way, it helps us with our tone and how we format the content. And keep in mind, if it gets too long, there might be time to stop writing and actually pick up a phone and go verbal. And if you ever get an email to the entire office, that says there's a Buick with its light on, don't respond to all. How often have you had your inbox filled up with "not mine, I have a Honda"? If there's a subject that you're particularly passionate about, it might be a good idea to take a step back, put it in a draft folder for review so you can look at it less emotionally at a later time. The disadvantage to email is that it makes it easy for us to kind of pop off a response that we could potentially regret later. Tone is important. As mentioned before, email is kind of missing those important physical and verbal cues. So, it's really good just to assume that if something can be misunderstood, it probably will be misunderstood by someone. That can include things as simple as how we emphasize. I mean, I've had comics come back to me for having, text bolded or colored in what they perceive to be an angry red. As a result, I kind of suggest avoiding using red as an emphatic color if you can. But if we move from email now to verbal, we've all been on conference calls where we've wondered about phone etiquette. There's some things we can do to make our phone discussions a lot more productive. I mean, first, how often have we been on conference calls where there's been dogs barking or birds squawking, or you hear kids, playing in the background, construction, any kind of number of things that makes it difficult to hear a conversation. And I'm really not sure what's more annoying, hearing, the animals or the kids in the background, or having the person on the call keep yelling at them to be quiet. An agenda is critical. We're all busy people. It can be very frustrating going into a call without any idea what the call is about or what we're going to accomplish. I always have an agenda. It doesn't have to be a detailed agenda, but it should at least give the callers a clear idea of what the call is for and what needs to be taken away. I've even told my staff during busy points to decline a meeting that didn't have an agenda. Related to that is, please, knowing how to use the conference tool. Please, and I can emphasize this, please, if you are demonstrating something like an application or need to use an app on the call is not the time or the venue to learn how to use it, or have other people on the call provide training for that. If you're not sure how something works, be sure to rehearse it ahead of time. And if you have slides, use the slides to enhance the discussion, not drive the discussion. It's a huge waste of time for somebody to just read the slide on a call. I mean, if that's all that's needed, then just send out the deck and ask for feedback. How big is the call? Size, it matters. There was a time when a conference call was limited to how many lines there were that could come to your phone. But today, we can set up a conference call on the web that can have, hundreds or thousands of people. Just because someone might be interested in a topic doesn't mean they need to be invited to the call. Unless there's a clear reason for all of those people to be there, it's a waste of time and resources. On the other hand, it shouldn't be so small that important people aren't left, or important people are left out. If a decision has to be made on the call, make sure that the decision maker is included. If someone out there has critical information for the call, make sure that person is invited and available. Keep track of your accepts and declines. And if these important people are not available, don't wait for the call to start to discover that they're not available. Be respectful of everyone's time and reschedule it. Last but not least, be here now. This is an initiative that was kicked off in our company, and essentially means that whatever you're doing, provide your undivided attention to it. If you're on a call, focus on the call. Technology allows us to multitask, and many people can say that they can do that effectively, but the truth is, we've all been on calls where, Bob has asked a question, and Bob clearly wasn't paying the least bit of attention to the conversation, and so we have to rehatch a lot of information. So be here now. Focus on what's happening. Technology has always also made it available to some new ways for us to communicate, streaming media being one of them. Some companies have begun to utilize this as a means of passing on important info. Podcasts can be very informative and provide updates and training. Make sure that the format of your podcast aligns with the standards within your company. Speaking from experience, if you have a podcast that's specific to Apple, make sure that Apple is an approved product for use. We've also seen the use of both the pre-recorded and live streams of video. Production values, very important. Too slick a production as well as poor production values. If it's a live stream, make sure you have enough bandwidth to accommodate the projected audience. It can be frustrating to have a lot of buffering of the audio or the video if the turnout is larger than you expect. And an important question is, how do we make sure people are actually viewing this? We need to communicate ahead of time what the topic is, why the topic will benefit the viewer, and make the production as interesting enough by adding some sort of interactivity to keep people's attention. Some guy sitting behind a desk just reading a bunch of words can get pretty boring. Automation is a huge help by providing regular updates that don't just require any manual input. It can go out and format data from various databases and send that out to specific audiences, either through email or some sort of real-time dashboard. But like with any other communication, format and tone are important. If we need action on the part of our recipient, asking politely is a lot better than being demanding. Color and font make a difference. Again, I mentioned before the feedback I received about using bolds and red, and that feedback that I received was actually in reference to an automated email that was going out. Real-time dashboards can be very informative, but be sure they're clear and easy to read. There's a number of great rules out there for building a dashboard. There's actually an article in the latest support world this month. If anyone's interested in reading about it, we don't have nearly enough time to go through it here, except to say keep them simple, concise, and contextual. Social media. Other than email, social media has probably the most potential to impact how we communicate. In many industries, it's a bit scary because the types of information that they work with. For example, I work in a large healthcare environment, and we're not allowed to have social media on our business devices at all, and even the sites are blocked by our corporate firewall. Now, we do what we can, but the fact is that social media is very pervasive, and there's really no stopping it. Everyone has some sort of app on their phone that's related to sharing files or opinions, and if someone wanted to use their phone to take a photo of a celebrity's medical records and post them online, not a lot we could do to prevent them from doing that, not physically. There's obviously HR ramifications and ethical ramifications. That person would be dismissed, but by the time that happened, the damage is already done. So there's an element of ethics and, I guess, personal honesty involved there. In a more general sense, the impact of social media can be very positive, or it can be devastating. I mean, there are whole TV shows now that are based on videos captured and shared online. If you're in the right place at the right time, you can literally make or break someone's career. You can make them famous. You can ruin their life. A viral tweet of 140 characters or less can actually cause the stock price of a major corporation to drop, costing them millions or billions of dollars. So we can't discount the impact of social media. Some organizations have been successful using these tools as part of their support strategy. We can talk to our friends over in higher ed. They can vouch for that. And many companies use them to respond to their customers, since their customers are using this technology for their complaints or compliments. And if we didn't respond in kind, we'd be foolish. So just be sure to respond appropriately, like email. Our tone and our content is important. Keep in mind that a wrong step or a wrong response can be seen by thousands or millions of people. So I'd like to wrap up with a few things that we can do proactively to improve our ability to communicate with our customers. Communication is really a simple idea that can be difficult to implement. First, I'm going to harp on this again. Always, always, always check your content. Know who your audience is. Tailor your communication to them appropriately. Make it clear, make it easy to understand. Avoid acronyms if you can, or define them. Those last two bullets there came from my communications team. I kind of polled them before I put this together on what they felt was the most important thing to remember. These two rules that they gave us applied to both. They used the example of a new security procedure, two-factor authentication stuff that we're rolling out. There were some customer communications that went out explaining the new processes. We thought it was very clear. For example, at the top of the page, there was a clear, bold notice that said, "Important note for telecommuters," that guided them to a separate web page that contained step-by-step instructions for how to log into the system. Every single incident that we opened by a telecommuter could have been avoided if they had followed the link. And we've seen similar things happen within IT when technical processes has changed. So we tend to assume that people will understand, but as the moral of the slide shows, you can never overestimate your reader's ability to understand, and you can't assume that everyone reading your message will interpret it the same way. Don't wait for a crisis to communicate with your customers. Build some sort of regular communication. It could be an email, internet, FAQ, IT newsletter. Make it interesting and fun. Fields of text or data doesn't hold someone's attention. I mean, we're IT. Let's use technology to make a newsletter that's interactive. Stream a podcast. Stream a how-to video. Talk about our successes, our goals. How we're aligned with the business. Consider, self-help stuff. Have a section on what the customer can do to help themselves. And once it's been out there for a while, go back to your targeted audience for their feedback on what works and what doesn't, or if there's other content that we could provide that would actually encourage them to look forward to hearing from us. So in conclusion, as our customers get more engaged, the more they're going to enjoy their interaction with IT. We're not going to be those guys out there, like a harbinger of doom. Rather, we're going to be, a part of their normal business routine. And when we become that, that's going to lead to better metrics because we have an informed and happy customer, and they won't need to call the service desk as office. And finally, one more time, know your audience. Don't send the same form letter to everyone. Tailor your communication to the people who need to understand it. If you take one thing away from this presentation, that's the most important. Know your audience. Ultimately, good communication is the foundation of good customer service. And Roy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks very much, Mike. I really appreciate it. We're going to move right along now, and we're going to hear from Claudia Dent. And Claudia has many years of experience in the technology industry and held executive positions in product management, marketing, business development, and general management at companies ranging from startups to global enterprises. So, Claudia, thanks for being with us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Roy, and welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about communication from the perspective of how to automate communication. From an Everbridge perspective, we provide global communications, a critical communications platform that really enables you to automate your communications in a way that adheres to many of the things that Mike was talking about. And I'm going to try and highlight that as I go through my presentation. Just a few other things about Everbridge. We are a global organization, and that enables us to, reach out to people around the world from a communication perspective. And one of the things that Mike talked about was how important it was to be able to reach people in a way that they can, quickly understand, what is transpiring and will getting their attention, et cetera, all of those things. And Everbridge is market leading from a critical communications perspective. This is our 11th year, being that market leader. One of the things that Mike talked about is know your audience. And, I couldn't agree with that more. When something happens in the IT world, whether it's a systems failure or whether it's something, that you want to, celebrate or make sure people understand what's happening, there are different audiences and different ways in which you need to reach out to these audiences. The first thing you need to do is reach out to the people who need to fix the problem. And they need to understand the nature of that very clearly, and without, any kind of, misunderstanding. All the communication needs to be, particularly if you're dealing with global teams, needs to be very clear. That language needs to be consistent. So that's another issue, is around consistency, particularly if you're dealing with global resolver teams. The second audience is your executives and stakeholders. Obviously, they need a different message and a different line of communication, and also being able to notify those key customers in a way that instills confidence that you're going to resolve the problem, you know the situation, you understand what's at stake for them, etc. Because without clear communications, you waste a lot of precious time. This week alone, I've spent some time with large global customers that are telling me that, oftentimes the people that are trying to resolve problems, IT problems, they keep getting calls from stakeholders. Hey, when's it going to be fixed? What do I tell my customer? And so they're wasting time trying to manage all of these other external issues, taking away from the time that they're actually spending fixing the problem. So from an Everbridge perspective, that is exactly what we are here to automate for you. The whole issue is, how do you automate communications in the IT world and make sure that you articulate what you're trying to alert, who really needs to know, how you're going to reach those people, and how you're going to collaborate. So let's spend a little time on this, because this is really the heart of Everbridge automation. The first thing is being able to have predefined templates that automate very specific communications workflows. And this hits upon some of the major challenges that Mike was talking about. If you're communicating to many different cultures, to different people, you want to make sure that your messages, whether it's some low impact routine event all the way up to some very large serious event, are consistent, so that people are expecting your communications. They understand the typical language that you're using and the terminology, etc., so that they can all respond appropriately. And a way to really drive some of this consistency is through automation, leveraging a set of templates that are predefined with the language and the specific communication workflow. And when we talk about the communication workflow, we talk about, for each different kind of situation, who are you going to send this communication to? And how do you get the people who really need to respond? We automate through that, an on-call scheduling solution that's tied to our communications engine. So you don't wake up someone in the middle of the night who doesn't really need to know. You only get the people who really need to respond. And for stakeholders and customers, you communicate to them in a way that's appropriate for what their needs are as well. If it's a low-impact routine event, you don't have to wake everyone up in the middle of the night, but they might want an email in the morning. So it's not only who needs to know, but how you're going to reach them. And I think, Mike also brought up a lot of good points around today's mobile technology and the fact that we have so many different ways to communicate with people. Finding and ensuring that we're using the right vehicle for IT communication purposes is very important. So having this multimodal approach in how to reach people under certain circumstances is also incredibly important. And then finally, how are you going to collaborate? So Everbridge provides things like a one-click conference bridge. So if you have a certain situation and you need to assemble a team based on different parameters, the priority of the situation, what system elements are involved, what applications, etc., you can automatically call upon that right team and join them to a conference bridge. So you're not wasting time setting all that stuff up. It's all automated. Oh, and what happens if someone from a certain team, the database team, for example, doesn't respond? Well, let's escalate to the next person based on a set of escalation rules. Oh, and wouldn't you like to know and have an audit trail of who responds and maybe why they don't respond? So maybe they don't respond because they never got the message, but maybe they're busy with another fire. That's another challenge that we have in terms of reaching out to people and communicating, is the fact that sometimes people are busy with another fire, etc. And really this is about the Everbridge automated communications and what we provide. So just a couple other things here, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions. Everbridge does very tightly integrate with Help Desk. So the Help Desk is really a single pane of glass, and based on a Help Desk ticket and the priorities and parameters that you enter into that ticket, that whole communication process is automated behind the scenes. So that Help Desk person never ever has to worry that the right people are getting involved to provide the right support behind the scenes. And one of the things that Mike mentioned many times is, finding the right balance with communicating with the business leadership can be challenging. Is it too much, not enough, etc.? Well, Everbridge has a simple answer to that question. Ask them. Leverage a opt-in portal so that business leaders and stakeholders can opt into the specific information that they're interested in learning about, whatever applications are important to them, the severity of issues, etc., and also enable them to choose how they want to get notified. So this is a way also to engage your community and make sure that you're communicating with those business leaders in a way that is most effective for them. Finally, I just want to make a note that Everbridge, has over 3,000 customers across multiple markets, and I could spend all day talking about Everbridge and the critical communications platform that we provide, but I do want the opportunity to get to your questions. Please, I will now turn it back over to Roy, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Claudia. We really appreciate it. I know we are a little bit over time, but people have decided to stay because they're interested in hearing more about it. One quick question for you, Claudia. Does Everbridge integrate with other ITSM tools? I noticed that we had ServiceNow on your slide, but I'm presuming it does.
Yes, that's a great question, and that slide is just one example. We integrate with many help desk tools, and we also integrate with hundreds of ITSM monitoring tools, such as, Nagios, SolarWinds, Dynatrace, etc. So, hundreds of those kinds of tools that actually, monitor the health and well-being of systems, IBM, CA, etc.
Thank you very much. Attendees, the survey has opened up on your screens. We really appreciate all your feedback. Please help us improve webinars in the future by telling us exactly what you think and answering the questions. Tune in December, on December 15th, for our webinar about the future of metrics with John Custy, the analytics era. And thank you for being with us, and thanks to Everbridge for sponsoring. This webcast is copyright 2015 by United Business Media, LLC. Presentation materials are owned or copyrighted by HDI and Everbridge, who are solely responsible for the content. And thank you again for attending, and thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.